I never thought the words, "not tonight, not ever," would come from the woman I once believed was my forever. For years I tried to be the husband who supported, provided, and stood by her through every storm, but somehow I became invisible in my own marriage. What started as small dismissals turned into a wall I could no longer climb, and when she finally pushed me away for good, I stumbled into the arms of someone who didn't just accept me sometimes. She looked me straight in the eye and promised me always. This is the story of how I lost the woman I thought I couldn't live without, only to find the one who made me realize what love was supposed to feel like all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, I've been the type of man who takes his commitments seriously. I grew up in the small town of Fairbrook, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and reputation matters. My parents had been together for 40 years, and I saw firsthand what it meant to fight through hardships and remain loyal. That was the model I carried into my own marriage. When I met Rachel, she was unlike anyone else I had known, sharp-witted, ambitious, and beautiful in a way that turned heads when she walked into a room. I felt lucky to have her, and in the early days, she made me believe she felt the same about me. We got married after 3 years of dating, and for a while, it really did feel like a partnership built on love, respect, and shared dreams. Our home was modest, nothing fancy, but it was ours. I worked as an IT consultant, often long hours, while Rachel taught English at a nearby high school. She loved her students and poured her energy into them, coming home with stories that made me admire her passion. In those first years, our evenings were filled with laughter, shared dinners, and small rituals, like watching our favorite shows together on the couch. To outsiders, we looked like the ideal couple. Inside, I told myself that we were building the kind of life my parents had modeled, steady, loyal, built to last. But beneath the surface, there were cracks I didn't want to acknowledge. Rachel was always more restless than I was. She thrived on attention and validation, while I was content with quiet consistency. I thought opposites balanced each other out, that my stability would anchor her, but looking back, I can see how she began to see me less as a partner and more as background noise. At first, it was subtle. Her brushing off my attempts to plan a date night, or laughing at my suggestions for a weekend trip like they were childish. I'd let it slide, telling myself she was stressed from work, that she needed space, that this was just a phase. What I didn't realize then was how quickly those small dismissals can chip away at intimacy. The phrase "not tonight" started as an occasional excuse after a long day, but over time it became the soundtrack of my evenings. Each rejection wasn't just about intimacy. It was about connection, about feeling wanted, about being seen. And when she finally uttered the words, "not tonight, not ever," it wasn't just about turning me down. It was about shutting a door that I had been desperately trying to keep open. Still, in those days before everything collapsed, I was blind to just how much I was losing myself in the process of holding on. I kept trying to make things better, to rekindle what we once had. I cooked dinners, brought home flowers, even suggested counseling, but every effort was met with indifference or thinly veiled annoyance. "You're too much," she'd say, or "why can't you just be happy with what we have?" And so, little by little, I shrank myself down, believing that maybe if I stopped asking for so much, she would come back to me. The truth is, I was lonely even while sharing a bed with my wife. There's a kind of loneliness that cuts deeper than being alone. It's the loneliness of lying beside someone you love and feeling like you don't exist. I'd stay awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had changed, what I had done wrong. The man who once believed in forever was now bargaining with silence, holding on to hope that Rachel might look at me the way she used to. Looking back, I see how naive I was, how much I clung to the idea of love rather than the reality of what it had become. But at that time, all I could think was, marriages go through phases. People drift and come back. If I just waited long enough, if I just tried hard enough, maybe she'd remember what we once were. That was my baseline, my normal, the quiet desperation of a man holding on to the ghost of a marriage. I didn't know then that life was about to rip me out of that cycle, that the words I dreaded most, not tonight, not ever, would be the catalyst for everything that followed. And that in the rubble of rejection, I would discover something I had never truly known before. Love that didn't make me beg for scraps, but instead offered itself freely, without condition, without limits. Love that said always. I still remember the first time I saw Rachel and how the world seemed to sharpen around her presence. It was at a friend's birthday party, one of those gatherings where most people knew each other already and newcomers stood out. She walked in wearing a pale blue dress that somehow made her seem both casual and impossibly elegant, her hair loose around her shoulders, and a smile that carried just enough mischief to make me wonder what secret she was keeping. She wasn't the kind of woman who just entered a room. She claimed it. People gravitated toward her, not because she demanded attention, but because she exuded an energy that drew you in before you realized it. I was one of the many who noticed her that night, but unlike everyone else, she noticed me back. Our first conversation was about books, of all things. She had spotted the paperback I carried under my arm, something I had brought because I didn't know how long I'd stay at the party and figured I might sneak off to read. When she saw the title, she raised an eyebrow and said, "You're either really boring or really interesting." That was Rachel. Never subtle, never shy about teasing. I laughed, told her I hoped I leaned toward interesting, and before I knew it, we had spent nearly an hour talking in a corner of the room, while the rest of the party faded into background noise. I was struck not just by her beauty, but by her intensity. She asked questions like she wanted to peel back layers, and when she told me about her own love of literature, her career dreams, and the way she saw the world, I felt like I'd stumbled into something rare. We exchanged numbers before the night ended, and for the next few weeks we talked constantly. Texts during the day, calls that stretched late into the night, conversations that flowed so easily it felt like I had known her for years. She was passionate about her students, frustrated with the limitations of the education system, but also hopeful about making an impact. She had a way of speaking that was equal parts conviction and charm, and it made me admire her even more. Our first official date was at a small Italian restaurant, and when she laughed at my corny attempt to order in a terrible accent, I thought, this is it. This is someone I could really build a life with. The beginning was filled with the kind of moments people write love stories about. Late-night drives with the windows down, sharing our favorite songs as if the playlist was a secret language only we understood. Afternoons spent wandering through bookstores, coffee cups in hand, pretending we were only browsing when in reality we were silently testing how much our tastes aligned. Weekend getaways where everything felt like an adventure, even if it was just a 2-hour drive to a neighboring town. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't realized I was missing, and I became addicted to that spark she brought into my life. But even then, if I'm honest, there were little glimpses of the woman she would later become, the parts of her that weren't as easy to love. Rachel had high expectations, not just of herself, but of everyone around her. She could be critical in ways that stung, even when she laughed it off as teasing. Once, early on, she rolled her eyes at the way I folded laundry, muttering, "You're lucky you're cute, because you're not exactly domestic material." I laughed along, because it seemed harmless, but deep down, it planted the tiniest seed of unease. Another time, when I surprised her with flowers at her workplace, she accepted them with a smile but later told me, "It was sweet, but maybe a little much." People were staring. I brushed it off, thinking she just wasn't used to public attention, but part of me wondered why affection had to be measured so carefully. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Still, in those early days, the good far outweighed the questionable. For every moment of critique, there were 10 moments of genuine warmth. She would leave little notes in my jacket pocket, scribbles of encouragement like, "You've got this today," or "Thinking of you." When I got sick with the flu, she showed up at my apartment with soup, medicine, and the determination to nurse me back to health. When she laughed, really laughed, it was the kind of sound that could make even the worst day bearable. I convinced myself that any small flaws were just quirks, that every relationship had them, and that what we had was stronger than any of those fleeting doubts. As months turned into years, Rachel and I built routines that felt comforting. We'd cook together on Sundays, argue over recipes, and then collapse on the couch in victory or defeat, depending on how the meal turned out. We created traditions like watching the first snowfall of the year with mugs of hot chocolate, or leaving each other riddles on sticky notes that had to be solved before the other one came home. Friends envied our connection, and family members commented on how natural we seemed together. I took those words as validation, as if they confirmed that I wasn't imagining what we had. Looking back, I can see how I romanticized those early years, clinging to them as proof of what Rachel and I could be at our best. The little criticisms, the moments where she seemed distant, the way she sometimes demanded more than I could give, those were all warning signs. But when you're in love, you don't catalog red flags, you justify them. You tell yourself that passion comes with sharp edges, that every relationship has its ups and downs, and that love means accepting someone wholly, flaws and all. I told myself that what we had was rare, that she was worth every compromise, and that whatever challenges we faced, we would work through them together. That was the beginning, filled with light, laughter, and the intoxicating illusion that we were unbreakable. I had no way of knowing then that the same fire that drew me to her would one day burn me down. At that time, all I knew was that I loved her, and I believed she loved me, and that was enough to silence any doubt. The years that followed our whirlwind beginning were filled with moments I thought would last forever. When I look back on those times now, it's easy to understand why I held on so tightly later, why I tried to salvage something that was already slipping away. Because for a while, Rachel and I were good together. Better than good, even. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like the very definition of happiness. And in many ways, it felt that way on the inside, too. Our first apartment together was small, barely big enough for the two of us, but it became our little sanctuary. The walls were thin, the plumbing made noises in the middle of the night, and we had to maneuver around each other in the cramped kitchen, but none of that mattered. We painted the living room a warm shade of yellow, picked out mismatched furniture that somehow fit together, and filled the space with laughter and late-night conversations. Rachel loved to host, even in our tiny place, and our friends often squeezed onto our worn-out couch while she poured drinks and told stories with her signature flair. Those nights felt like proof that we were building something real, something shared not just between us, but with the people who mattered to us both. Sundays became our ritual. I'd wake up first, make coffee, and sit by the window with a book while Rachel slowly emerged from sleep, her hair a mess, her voice groggy but sweet when she mumbled, "Morning." We'd cook breakfast together, pancakes if we felt ambitious, eggs and toast if we didn't, and then spend the day doing whatever felt right. Sometimes it was cleaning the apartment while blasting music, other times it was binge-watching a show until our eyes burned. There was something comforting in the routine, in knowing that even as life pulled us in different directions during the week, we'd always circle back to each other on Sundays. Travel was another part of our good times. We didn't have the money for grand vacations, but we found joy in small adventures. A weekend trip to the mountains, where we hiked until our legs ached and then collapsed by a fire, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms. A spontaneous drive to the coast, where we ate greasy seafood from a roadside stand and watched the sunset from the hood of the car. Rachel had a way of turning the ordinary into something magical. Even grocery shopping with her could feel like an event, the two of us playfully arguing over which cereal to buy, or sneaking treats into the cart when the other wasn't looking. Those moments made me feel like we had a secret language, like we were co-conspirators in a life that was uniquely ours. One memory stands out more vividly than most. It was our second wedding anniversary, and we didn't have much money to celebrate in the traditional sense. Instead, Rachel suggested we recreate our first date at home. She cooked pasta while I attempted to mimic the Italian waiter's over-the-top accent from years ago, and we laughed so hard we nearly dropped the plates. After dinner, she surprised me with a scrapbook she had been working on for months. Photos, ticket stubs, handwritten notes documenting our journey together. On the last page she had written, "Here's to all the pages we haven't filled yet." I remember staring at those words and thinking, this is it. This is love. This is forever. Our families often told us we were lucky to have found each other. My mother adored Rachel, saying she was the daughter she never had. Rachel's father respected me for being steady, dependable, a man he could trust with his little girl. Those validations mattered to me, not because I needed approval, but because they reinforced what I already believed. that Rachel and I were building a life that others could admire and maybe even envy. We weren't perfect, but who was? At the end of the day, we chose each other, and that choice felt solid. Even our arguments back then had a certain softness to them. We'd bicker over small things. Who left the lights on? Why I always misplaced my keys. Her habit of buying too many shoes. But it never lasted long. Rachel had a way of diffusing tension with a joke, a playful shove, or a sudden kiss that made me forget what we were fighting about. I told myself that this was the sign of a healthy relationship. Disagreements, sure, but always resolved with love. It was in those good times that I made my vows to myself. I promised I would always be there for her no matter what. I promised I would fight for us if things ever got hard. I promised I would never give up on what we had built. Those weren't just idle words. They were commitments etched into my very identity. Rachel wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my confidant, my best friend. I couldn't imagine a life without her in it. Looking back now, I can see how much weight I placed on those memories, how tightly I clung to them when the cracks began to show. The Sunday mornings, the road trips, the laughter, the scrapbook, all of it became proof in my mind that what we had was worth saving. That's the danger of the good times. They don't just make you happy in the moment, they become anchors that keep you tethered long after the ship has started to sink. But in that season of our lives, I wasn't thinking about storms or cracks or sinking ships. I was simply in love, reveling in the life we had created together. Rachel was still the woman I had fallen for. Vibrant, passionate, intoxicating. And I believed with every fiber of my being that we were unbreakable. Those good times were the foundation of my hope, the reason I fought so hard when things began to unravel. Because once you've known a love that feels like home, you'll do almost anything to keep from losing it. It's strange how the beginning of the end rarely announces itself with sirens or explosions. More often, it comes quietly, slipping into your life disguised as small moments that don't seem important until they accumulate and reveal a pattern you can no longer deny. For Rachel and me, the first warning signs weren't dramatic betrayals or screaming matches. They were subtle changes, almost invisible at first, but with each one, a piece of our connection loosened until one day I realized I was grasping at a rope that was already fraying. The first time I truly felt it was during one of our Sunday mornings. For years, those mornings had been sacred, our time to slow down, to reconnect after a long week. But one morning, I woke up to find Rachel already out of bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She barely looked up when I shuffled in, bleary-eyed, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I've got lesson plans to finish," she muttered, her eyes glued to the screen. I set her cup down beside her, waiting for the usual smile, but it never came. It seemed like a small thing, and I told myself she was just busy, but as I sat alone by the window drinking my coffee, I felt a shift I couldn't quite name. Then came the dinners. Rachel had once loved cooking together, even if half the time it ended in laughter over a meal that didn't quite turn out right. But gradually she began brushing off the idea. "I'm too tired," she'd say, or "let's just order in." At first, I didn't mind. I figured everyone goes through phases. But the rejection wasn't just about food. It was about time, about choosing convenience over connection. We still ate together, but it felt transactional, like feeding the body rather than nourishing the bond between us. One memory stands out more vividly than most. It was our 2nd wedding anniversary, and we didn't have much money to celebrate in the traditional sense. Instead, Rachel suggested we recreate our first date at home. She cooked pasta while I attempted to mimic the Italian waiter's over-the-top accent from years ago, and we laughed so hard we nearly dropped the plates. After dinner, she surprised me with a scrapbook she had been working on for months. Photos, ticket stubs, handwritten notes documenting our journey together. On the last page she had written, "Here's to all the pages we haven't filled yet." I remember staring at those words and thinking, this is it. This is love. This is forever. Our families often told us we were lucky to have found each other. My mother adored Rachel, saying she was the daughter she never had. Rachel's father respected me for being steady, dependable, a man he could trust with his little girl. Those validations mattered to me, not because I needed approval, but because they reinforced what I already believed, that Rachel and I were building a life that others could admire and maybe even envy. We weren't perfect, but who was? At the end of the day, we chose each other, and that choice felt solid. Even our arguments back then had a certain softness to them. We'd bicker over small things. Who left the lights on? Why I always misplaced my keys? her habit of buying too many shoes, but it never lasted long. Rachel had a way of diffusing tension with a joke, a playful shove, or a sudden kiss that made me forget what we were fighting about. I told myself that this was the sign of a healthy relationship. Disagreements, sure, but always resolved with love. It was in those good times that I made my vows to myself. I promised I would always be there for her, no matter what. I promised I would fight for us if things ever got hard. I promised I would never give up on what we had built. Those weren't just idle words. They were commitments etched into my very identity. Rachel wasn't just my wife. She was my partner, my confidant, my best friend. I couldn't imagine a life without her in it. Looking back now, I can see how much weight I placed on those memories, how tightly I clung to them when the cracks began to show. The Sunday mornings, the road trips, the laughter, the scrapbook, all of it became proof in my mind that what we had was worth saving. That's the danger of the good times. They don't just make you happy in the moment, they become anchors that keep you tethered long after the ship has started to sink. But in that season of our lives, I wasn't thinking about storms or cracks or sinking ships. I was simply in love, reveling in the life we had created together. Rachel was still the woman I had fallen for, vibrant, passionate, intoxicating, and I believed with every fiber of my being that we were unbreakable. Those good times were the foundation of my hope, the reason I fought so hard when things began to unravel. Because once you've known a love that feels like home, you'll do almost anything to keep from losing it. It's strange how the beginning of the end rarely announces itself with sirens or explosions. More often it comes quietly, slipping into your life disguised as small moments that don't seem important, until they accumulate and reveal a pattern you can no longer deny. For Rachel and me, the first warning signs weren't dramatic betrayals or screaming matches. They were subtle changes, almost invisible at first, but with each one, a piece of our connection loosened until one day I realized I was grasping at a rope that was already fraying. The first time I truly felt it was during one of our Sunday mornings. For years, those mornings had been sacred, our time to slow down, to reconnect after a long week. But one morning, I woke up to find Rachel already out of bed, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She barely looked up when I shuffled in, bleary-eyed, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I've got lesson plans to finish," she muttered, her eyes glued to the screen. I set her cup down beside her, waiting for the usual smile, but it never came. It seemed like a small thing, and I told myself she was just busy, but as I sat alone by the window drinking my coffee, I felt a shift I couldn't quite name. Then came the dinners. Rachel had once loved cooking together, even if half the time it ended in laughter over a meal that didn't quite turn out right. But gradually she began brushing off the idea. "I'm too tired," she'd say, or, "Let's just order in." At first, I didn't mind. I figured everyone goes through phases, but the rejection wasn't just about food. It was about time, about choosing convenience over connection. We still ate together, but it felt transactional, like feeding the body rather than nourishing the bond between us. I noticed changes in the way she spoke to me, too. The playful teasing that once felt affectionate began to carry an edge. "You're hopeless," she'd say when I misplaced something. "You never think ahead." When I forgot an errand. They weren't cruel words, but they chipped away at me over time. I laughed them off because that's what I thought a good husband should do. Take it in stride. Not make a big deal out of small things. But late at night, those words echoed louder than I wanted to admit. Intimacy was another area where the warning signs crept in quietly. It started with occasional refusals. "Not tonight, I'm tired," or "I have a headache." Perfectly reasonable explanations, ones I had no right to challenge. But the refusals became more frequent, the excuses more varied, until they no longer felt like reasons but barriers. I told myself it was stress, that teaching was demanding and she needed space, but deep down I felt the sting of rejection. I missed her touch, the closeness that had once come so easily between us. It wasn't about the physical act. It was about feeling wanted, about knowing I still mattered to her in that way. Socially, things began to change too. Rachel, once eager to host and bring people into our lives, started making excuses to avoid gatherings with my friends. When we did go, she seemed distant, scrolling on her phone or excusing herself early. I tried to compensate, making extra effort to keep the conversations flowing, to smooth over her disinterest, but it left me exhausted. One evening after we left a friend's barbecue, she sighed in the car and said, "Your friends are so boring, Daniel. Do we really have to keep doing this?" It was a small comment, but it hurt. These were people who had stood by me for years, people who mattered to me, and her dismissal felt like a dismissal of part of my identity. Work became another wedge. Rachel started staying late more often, grading papers or attending meetings, she said. I believed her, of course, because why wouldn't I? But what struck me was the way she no longer rushed home. She used to text me when she was leaving, eager to share her day. Now, hours would pass without a word, and I'd find myself checking the clock, wondering when she'd walk through the door. When she finally did, she was often exhausted, her patience thin, her eyes glazed over as if she had already spent all her energy somewhere else. The way she looked at me changed too, though I didn't want to admit it. There was a time when her gaze carried warmth, admiration, even pride. But gradually it shifted into something cooler, more detached. Sometimes, when I caught her staring at me, it wasn't with affection but with a kind of irritation, as though my very presence was an inconvenience. I told myself it was stress, that she was going through a rough patch, that it wasn't about me. But the truth was written in her eyes, and no amount of rationalizing could erase it. I responded the only way I knew how, by trying harder. I bought flowers again, thinking they might spark the joy they once did. She accepted them with a polite smile, but set them aside without much thought. I planned small surprises. Her favorite dessert, a handwritten note left on the counter, but they were met with a distracted thanks before she returned to her phone or her work. Each attempt felt like shouting into a void, my love bouncing back at me with no echo. I didn't see these moments as warning signs at the time. I saw them as challenges, hurdles to overcome, evidence that I needed to be more patient, more attentive, more understanding. That's the trap of love, isn't it? You interpret indifference as tiredness, criticism as stress, distance as a phase. You convince yourself that if you just hold on, if you just love harder, everything will return to how it used to be. And so I held on, blind to the fact that the ground beneath me was already shifting. In hindsight, the signs were all there, the disengagement, the rejection, the subtle erosion of respect. They were whispers of the storm to come, warnings I chose not to hear. At the time, I clung to the memories of our good times, using them as armor against the growing evidence that something was deeply wrong. I told myself this was temporary, that Rachel would come back to me, that love was enough. But love, I was beginning to learn, isn't enough when it's one-sided. The shift from subtle unease to undeniable conflict didn't happen overnight, but it was steady, like a dripping faucet that you keep ignoring until the sink overflows. What had once been small irritations or passing dismissals began to take shape as something larger, heavier, more suffocating. I tried to convince myself that Rachel and I were just going through a rough season, the kind every marriage encounters. But deep down, I knew this was different. Something fundamental between us had cracked, and with each passing month, the gap widened until I could no longer pretend we were standing on solid ground. The arguments became sharper, where once we had laughed our way out of disagreements, now we clashed with an intensity that left the air in our apartment thick and unbreathable. It wasn't always about big issues. Sometimes it was as trivial as where to eat dinner or how much money to spend on groceries. But the tone had changed. There was venom in her words, a sharpness that seemed less about the topic at hand and more about me as a person. "You're impossible," she'd snap, or, "Do you ever think about anyone but yourself?" The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the way she delivered them, with a cold certainty that made me feel small, inadequate, unworthy. Intimacy, once a sore point, became almost non-existent. What had started as occasional refusals turned into a wall I couldn't break through, no matter how gently I approached it. I stopped asking after a while because the rejection cut too deep. I told myself that respecting her boundaries was the right thing to do, but inside, I was crumbling. It wasn't about sex. It was about closeness, connection, the reassurance that she still wanted me in her life in that way. Without it, I felt like a roommate, a placeholder, a man filling space in her world but not in her heart. Her time away from home increased too. Rachel claimed she was swamped with work, that teaching demanded more of her than I could possibly understand. And maybe some of that was true. Teaching is no easy job, but the way she distanced herself felt intentional. Nights stretched longer, with me waiting at the dinner table, staring at her untouched plate until it was cold. When she finally came home, her explanations were curt, her energy depleted, her patience non-existent. I tried to be supportive, to ask about her day, to listen without judgment, but more often than not, she brushed me off with a dismissive, "I don't want to talk about it." Friends began to notice the changes too. At gatherings, Rachel was either absent or visibly detached, scrolling through her phone, contributing little to conversations, leaving me to make excuses for her. "She's tired," I'd say. "Work's been tough," but the looks I received in return told me that they weren't buying it, and truthfully, neither was I. My friends were polite enough not to press, but their silence was its own kind of judgment, a mirror reflecting the truth I didn't want to face, that my marriage was unraveling before their eyes. The silence between Rachel and me became unbearable. We used to talk for hours about everything, dreams, fears, plans for the future, but now our conversations were reduced to logistics. "Did you pay the bill? Can you pick up milk? What time is your appointment?" It was the language of survival, not connection. At night, we lay side by side in bed, separated by an invisible barrier. I'd lie awake, listening to her steady breathing, wondering if she was truly asleep or just pretending, unwilling to speak to me even in the dark. What cut deepest was the growing sense of contempt I saw in her eyes. It wasn't just indifference anymore, it was disdain. She began to criticize me openly, not just in private but in front of others. At a dinner with friends, she laughed when I shared a story, cutting in to say, "Daniel always exaggerates. He loves making himself sound more important than he is." The table chuckled politely, but my chest burned with humiliation. Later, when I confronted her about it, she rolled her eyes. "Don't be so sensitive. It was just a joke." But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like she was erasing me piece by piece, stripping away my dignity under the guise of humor. Financial stress added fuel to the fire. We weren't drowning, but money was tighter than we liked, and Rachel made sure I knew it was my fault. "If you worked harder, maybe we wouldn't have to worry," she'd say, ignoring the fact that I often put in 12-hour days at my consulting job. She dismissed my efforts, focusing only on what we lacked rather than what we had. Every bill, every unexpected expense became a battlefield, and somehow, I was always the enemy. Darkness. I clung to hope like a drowning man clings to driftwood. I suggested counseling again, hoping that maybe an outside voice could break through the wall between us. Rachel scoffed at the idea. "We don't need a stranger telling us how to live our lives," she said. "If you have a problem, maybe you should figure it out yourself." Her refusal left me hollow. I wanted to believe that marriage was about facing problems together, but increasingly, it felt like I was the only one still fighting. The worst moments came not in the middle of arguments, but in the quiet aftermath. I'd find myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the shadows on the wall, wondering how we had gone from laughter and late-night drives to silence and contempt. I replayed our good times over and over in my mind, clinging to them as proof that Rachel was still in there somewhere, that the woman who once loved me hadn't vanished completely. But the harder I searched for her, the clearer it became that she was slipping further away. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, present but unseen, shouting into a void that refused to answer back. And though I couldn't admit it then, a part of me knew that something was ending. The escalations weren't just rough patches. They were the unraveling of the fabric we had woven together. Each fight, each rejection, each silence was a thread pulled loose, and I didn't know how much longer the whole thing could hold before it fell apart completely. For a long time, I convinced myself that what was happening between Rachel and me was just a season, a rough patch we would eventually outgrow. I carried the burden quietly, too ashamed to admit that my marriage, once the envy of my friends, was crumbling in ways I couldn't stop. But silence can only hold so much weight before it cracks, and eventually, other voices entered the picture. At first I resisted them, brushing off their concerns, but slowly their words seeped into me, validating what I had been too afraid to face on my own. The first crack in my wall of denial came from my sister Emily. She had always been close to me, the kind of sibling who could read my mood before I even opened my mouth. One evening, she invited me over for dinner, insisting I needed a break from work. When I showed up alone, she asked casually, "Where's Rachel?" I mumbled something about her staying late at school to grade papers. Emily didn't press, but as we sat across from each other eating pasta, she studied me with that unblinking gaze only sisters have. "You don't look happy, Dan," she finally said. I tried to laugh it off, claiming I was just tired, but she didn't let it slide. "It's more than that. You're different, quieter, like you're carrying something heavy you don't want to talk about." I shrugged, insisting everything was fine, but the concern in her eyes told me she didn't believe me. Not long after, one of my closest friends, Mark, brought it up too. We were at a bar watching a game, something we used to do regularly but had done less and less as my marriage consumed more of my energy. After a few beers, he leaned in and said, "I've got to ask, man, are you and Rachel okay?" I froze, the question hitting me harder than I expected. "What do you mean?" I asked, defensive. He hesitated, then said, "It's just, she doesn't seem into it anymore. Every time we're all together, she looks bored, like she'd rather be anywhere else. And you look like you're trying too hard, like you're carrying both sides of the relationship." His words stung because they rang true. I deflected, joking that marriage was just complicated. But inside, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The validation came from strangers too, in subtle ways that were hard to ignore. At a work event, I brought Rachel along, hoping maybe a night out would spark something between us. Instead, she spent most of the evening glued to her phone, barely engaging with my colleagues. At one point, I overheard two coworkers whispering, "She doesn't seem very supportive of him, does she?" I wanted to spin around and defend her, to explain that she was just tired, that she had a lot on her plate, but the words died in my throat. Because the truth was they were right. She wasn't supportive. Not anymore. It wasn't just outsiders noticing. Rachel's own behavior sometimes betrayed her indifference more loudly than words ever could. One night during a family gathering at my parents' house, Rachel made a comment that stopped me cold. My mother had complimented her on her teaching, saying how lucky her students were to have someone so dedicated. Rachel smiled politely, then said, "Sometimes I wonder if I'd be better off dedicating all that energy to myself instead of everyone else. It's exhausting, always giving." She didn't look at me when she said it, but the implication hung in the air. She wasn't just talking about her job. I caught Emily watching me from across the room, her expression a mix of sympathy and warning. Even casual acquaintances picked up on the tension. A neighbor once joked, "I never see you two together anymore. Did you finally give her too many reasons to escape?" He laughed, clearly not realizing how close to the mark he was. But the comment cut deep. I smiled weakly, brushing it off, but when I walked back into our apartment later that night and found Rachel already asleep in the other room, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe everyone else saw our cracks more clearly than I did. What struck me most about all these moments was how they slowly eroded the story I had been telling myself. For so long, I believed I was exaggerating the problems, that maybe I was too sensitive or too needy. Rachel often told me as much, dismissing my concerns with lines like, "You're overthinking everything," or "Stop making drama where there isn't any." But when the people who loved me, the people who had no reason to lie, began to reflect back what I was feeling, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't creating problems out of thin air. Rachel really was pulling away. Emily eventually confronted me more directly. After another strained family dinner, where Rachel barely spoke a word, she pulled me aside as we were leaving. "Dan, you deserve someone who actually wants to be with you," she said quietly, her voice firm but full of compassion. "I know you love her, but love isn't supposed to look like this. You look like you're dying a little more each time I see you." Her words hit me like a blow, because deep down, I knew she was right. I just wasn't ready to accept it yet. Mark, too, refused to let it go. One night, after Rachel skipped yet another gathering, he said, "Look, man, I don't mean to interfere, but it's hard to watch you go through this. You keep showing up for her, and she doesn't even notice. At some point, you've got to ask yourself if she's ever going to meet you halfway." I wanted to defend her, to insist that things would get better, but the conviction in his voice made my excuses sound hollow even to myself. Piece by piece, the illusion I had built began to crumble. It wasn't just me who felt unwanted, unseen, dismissed. Others saw it too, and their voices became the mirror I couldn't avoid. I still wasn't ready to let go. I still clung desperately to the hope that Rachel would wake up one day and remember what we once had, but I could no longer deny that something was deeply broken. The validation was painful, but it was also freeing, in a way. For the first time, I began to understand that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't too much, I wasn't imagining things. The marriage I was trying so hard to save was already collapsing, and I was the only one still standing in the rubble pretending it was whole. The realization didn't arrive as a single thunderclap moment, not at first. It crept in quietly, building layer upon layer, until one day I found myself standing in the middle of my own life and no longer recognizing it. For months, I had lived with Rachel's coldness, her dismissive remarks, her absence, both physical and emotional, but I kept convincing myself to push forward, to endure, to keep hoping that something might change. Yet the body can only carry so much before it buckles, and the heart has limits too. My breaking point came not with shouting or slammed doors, but with a silence so complete it echoed louder than any argument we had ever had. It happened on a night that should have been ordinary. I had finished work late and picked up dinner from Rachel's favorite Thai place, thinking maybe the small gesture might bridge the distance between us, even just for an evening. I came home to find her on the couch, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up when I walked in. "I brought dinner," I said softly, setting the bags on the table. She didn't move. "Not hungry," she replied flatly, eyes still on the screen. I stood there for a moment, the smell of curry filling the room, and something inside me cracked. It wasn't just the rejection of food, it was the rejection of me, of my effort, of every attempt I had made to keep us tethered together. I sat down alone, eating from the container in silence, while she disappeared into the bedroom without another word. That night, lying awake in the dark, I turned over and whispered, "Rachel, are we okay?" There was no answer. I tried again, a little louder this time. "Do you even want to be married to me anymore?" Her reply was cold, sharp, delivered without hesitation. "Not tonight, Daniel, not ever." The words cut deeper than any insult or dismissal I had ever heard from her before. They weren't a joke, not an exaggeration, not even said in anger. They were simply the truth, spoken out loud for the first time. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the weight of her sentence crushing me, and for the first time in years I couldn't find a single thread of hope left to cling to. The following days blurred together. I went through the motions, work, meals, sleep, but everything felt hollow. Rachel moved around the apartment like a stranger, barely acknowledging my existence, and I stopped trying to force conversation. What was there left to say after "not ever"? I found myself crying in the car during my commute, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, ashamed of my own weakness but unable to stop. Nights became unbearable, the silence between us louder than any screaming match. I slept on the couch more often than not, telling myself it was to give her space, but the truth was, I couldn't bear lying next to someone who had already told me, with absolute certainty, that she didn't want me. One evening, my sister Emily called, her voice gentle but firm. "Dan, you sound like you're breaking," she said after I failed to hold back my tears. "I can hear it in you. I know you love her, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. Love isn't supposed to destroy you." I wanted to argue, to insist that marriage meant fighting until the very end, but all I managed to whisper was, "She said not ever." The silence on the other end told me Emily understood exactly what that meant. "Then that's your answer," she said quietly. "You don't have to keep waiting for her to change. She's already told you she won't." Even Mark, who had tried so hard to stay out of the personal details, confronted me when I met him for lunch. "Man, you're disappearing," he said bluntly. "You look 10 years older than you did last year. You're not yourself anymore." I don't know how else to say it, but she's killing you, Dan, piece by piece. At some point, you've got to decide if you want to live like this forever. I sat there staring at my half-eaten sandwich, unable to deny it anymore. He was right. I had become a shell of who I once was, drained of laughter, of joy, of the simple energy to live. The final straw came a week later, when Rachel announced, without preamble, that she was going to spend the weekend with a group of colleagues out of town. I asked who was going, if I could maybe join, and she scoffed. "It's work, Daniel. You wouldn't fit in. Don't make this about you. Her words were dismissive, but what hit me harder was the total lack of consideration. She didn't even think it necessary to involve me in her plans anymore. She lived her life, and I was simply a background character in it. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after she had gone to bed, staring at the dark window, my reflection hollow-eyed and empty. And in that stillness, I knew it was over. Not in the way people casually threaten breakups during fights, but in the quiet, devastating way you realize a chapter has ended before you've even turned the page. The phrase "not tonight, not ever" echoed in my mind like a bell tolling the death of our marriage. I could no longer lie to myself, no longer cling to memories of laughter and closeness as proof that she might still love me. She had said it plainly, and her actions had confirmed it 100 times over. The love I had been fighting for was gone, replaced by disdain, contempt, and silence. And no matter how much it broke me, I finally understood that the only way forward was to stop holding on. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't even try to talk to her. I just sat there, breathing in the silence, and accepted for the first time that my marriage had died long before I had admitted it. And in that acceptance, painful as it was, came the clarity I had been too afraid to face. It was time to let go. After Rachel's words, "Not tonight, not ever," something inside me quietly shifted. For weeks, I had walked through my days like a shadow of myself, clinging to scraps of hope that never materialized. But once the realization settled in that there was nothing left to fight for, a strange calm replaced the turmoil. It wasn't relief, not exactly, but clarity, the kind that comes when the fog finally lifts and you can see the wreckage for what it is. I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. Not because I wanted to, not because I stopped loving her overnight, but because staying meant dying a little more every single day. Making the decision was one thing. Following through was another. For years, I had defined myself as Rachel's husband, the man who had promised to love her through thick and thin. Walking away felt like betraying that promise, like admitting failure. But what I came to understand was that love without reciprocity isn't love at all. It's servitude. It took nights of sleepless pacing, endless conversations with myself in the mirror, and hours of staring at the door, wondering if I had the strength to walk through it. In the end, it wasn't strength that pushed me forward, it was survival. The morning I told her, the apartment was bathed in soft light, the kind of golden warmth that once would have made me want to linger in bed with her. Instead, I stood in the kitchen clutching a cup of coffee, my hands trembling, my heart hammering in my chest. Rachel walked in, barely acknowledging me, and I realized that this was our normal now. Silence, indifference, avoidance. I set the mug down and took a breath. "Rachel, I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Do what?" she asked flatly. "This. Us. The marriage. I've tried, but you don't want me. You've said it yourself. And I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." For a moment, I thought she might argue, might protest, or even show some flicker of emotion. But she just shrugged, as if I had told her I was going to the store. "If that's what you want," she said simply, turning back to the counter. The finality of her indifference was worse than anger, but it also confirmed I was making the right choice. Leaving wasn't easy. Packing up years of shared life into boxes felt like tearing out pieces of myself. Every photo frame, every mug, every item of clothing carried memories of better times, and I found myself crying over things as small as a pair of socks. But with each box I sealed, I also felt a small weight lift. I wasn't abandoning my life. I was reclaiming it. The day I walked out for the last time, I paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the apartment that had been both a home and a prison. Rachel didn't come to the door. She didn't say goodbye. She stayed in the bedroom, silent, and that silence became the final punctuation mark on the story of us. The first few weeks on my own were brutal. The emptiness of my new apartment echoed with loneliness. I missed the familiarity of Rachel's presence, even if it had been cold and distant. I questioned myself constantly. Had I given up too soon? Should I have fought harder? Could I have done more? But every time I remembered her words, "Not tonight, not ever," I reminded myself that love isn't something you can beg for or force. It has to be freely given, and she had made her choice. In the midst of rebuilding, I found unexpected light. Emily and Mark rallied around me, refusing to let me drown in solitude. They dragged me out for dinners, checked in constantly, and reminded me that I was still worth loving. It was through them that I started to reconnect with the world, to remember what laughter felt like, to remember that life didn't end with Rachel. And then, almost when I least expected it, I met someone who changed everything. Her name was Claire. She wasn't flashy or dramatic. She didn't sweep into my life with fanfare. She simply appeared, a friend of a friend at a small gathering. We started talking, and from the very first conversation there was an ease I hadn't felt in years. She listened, not just with her ears but with her whole presence, leaning in, asking questions, genuinely interested. There was warmth in her smile, kindness in her eyes, and when she laughed at my stories, it wasn't forced or mocking, it was real. Over time, our connection deepened. Where Rachel had built walls, Claire opened doors. Where Rachel had dismissed me, Claire validated me. Where Rachel had said, "Not ever," Claire whispered, "Always." It wasn't just about romance. It was about rediscovering what it felt like to be seen, to be valued, to be cherished. With Claire, I didn't feel like I was fighting to prove my worth. She made me feel like I was enough simply by existing. Slowly, the wounds Rachel had left began to heal. I realized that love doesn't have to be a battlefield. It can be a sanctuary. Looking back now, I see my journey for what it was. A descent into despair, followed by a climb back into the light. Rachel taught me painful lessons about indifference, about how love can wither when one person stops trying. But she also pushed me to a place where I had no choice but to rediscover myself. If she hadn't said those words, "Not tonight, not ever," I might still be trapped in a loveless cycle, wasting years chasing something that no longer existed. In her rejection, I found clarity. In my decision to leave, I found strength. And in Claire, I found the proof that love can still mean always. So if there's anything I've learned, it's this. Don't ignore the signs when someone stops choosing you. Don't convince yourself that suffering is the same as commitment. Love should be mutual, nurturing, affirming. It should build you up, not tear you down. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to walk away, not because you've stopped loving, but because you finally realize you deserve better. And when you find someone who looks at you and says, "Always," hold on to them, because that is the love that makes life worth living. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.